can hear me. I don't need the microphone. I have a big voice. James Hyman was our president of China Institute. A big welcome to all of you. Just curious, how many people the first time coming to China Institute? Yeah. Wow. Okay, well, welcome. So let me just give you a 2-minute elevator spiel a little bit and why we're sitting out here. We're sitting in the foyer. These are sort of our temporary phase 1 of a phase 3 build out. I just came this morning from the city with the Office of Management and Budget with the City of New York, so I'm delighted to say yes, we've secured several $1 million. Next time, and it's not a joke, this is a stand-up comedy, this is true. So next time you come, you'll be able to come through the main entrance on the ground floor. So the ground floor is connected to Washington Street, part of the revitalization of Lower Manhattan. We here have over 50,000 square feet. We moved from a quaint Upper East Side townhouse on 65th Street, where it was our home for 60 of our 95 years. So China Institute was founded 95 years ago as the first sort of cultural institute to help Americans get a little insight into what at the time was considered a very exotic, very distant, very difficult culture to have access to. Ironically, I personally, I lived in China 33 years. I'm married to a Chinese, so for me, I feel very comfortable in 2 cultures. But America, when I came back, and I've been back now 4.5 years, shockingly to me, feels less and less multicultural, less and less comfortable. And what we're trying to do at China Institute is connect people, give them a little bit of insight into what's happening in China, have a little bit more nuanced appreciation, because everything doesn't come across in the screaming headlines. And one of the things that's come across when we sit here and we talk and interact with people like you is, the feeling that China is a very earnest place. It's humorless. And I would take umbrage to that. And I think that the way that people think about humor can be very, very different and tell us a little bit of something, just like any of the other programs you have here. I'd encourage you to pick up and look, since it's the first time. We have programs in the business sphere, we've got programs in art, in culture, the gallery is exchanging and is in exhibitions for the next one. We have classes in Chinese, so we have classes in music. What else do we have? I was going to ask my director of education. Why don't you stand up and say hi?
Hi. Preschool. We also have preschool.
So what Sunjay was trying to say is we've had a school here for 90 years, and we're launching an immersion program for preschool kids. We already do Mandarin Munchkins. This is before the Munchkins. This is the pre-K. And we work with Trinity School uptown, with the UN International School. And how many Confucius classrooms down in the Boston area too?
6.
6 in the Boston area. So that'll give you some sort of little idea of what's going on. You can always go to our website. We've got a gala coming up in November. Jackie Chan will be the one next year. Yeah, we have all kinds of interesting things. Anyway, we didn't come in here for this spiel. I promised just an elevator pitch. So let me hand it over to my esteemed colleague, Tinda Elliott. Tinda looks after all of the programs, and she conceptualized and brought this one to life along with the dozens of others that she's brought to life this year. So China Institute wouldn't be what it is without her hand into the program. So let me turn it over to Tinda.
Said. Actually, this program was not my idea, but I wish it had been because it was a brilliant one. But this program is a total team effort. It was Aaron Nicholson, who is my colleague in the programming department, and Jeremy Willinger's idea. Who's somewhere here.
He's the funny guy. You didn't raise your hand.
Anyway, we're really thrilled to have this amazing panel of speakers and comedians with us tonight. So just one serious note before we jump into the program, and that is that, this is a very, very difficult time for U.S.-China relations, and the way in which Americans view China seems increasingly sort of monochromatic or simplistic, and one of the things we're really working hard on here is to add nuance to the conversation about China. These are the 2 most important countries in the world, and we have to learn, like it or not, we have to learn to work together and play together. And so what better way to add some nuance to the conversation than through comedy? So I'm very, very glad you're all here tonight. We have an amazing roster of people. We've got Jesse Appell, who has A number of people have just flown in from China. He just got here from China, I think yesterday, from Beijing. He is an amazing guy who does xiangshang in Chinese, and his Chinese is just beyond belief. And he also does English. He does both English language and Chinese language comedy in Beijing. And he's the founder of Laugh Beijing and the U.S.-China Comedy Center, which is a social enterprise focused on fulfilling the goal of bringing China and the West closer through laughter. We've also got Christopher Rea, who's a professor of Asian Studies at the University of British Columbia, and he is a real expert on the history of comedy. He's written a book called The Age of Irreverence, A New History of Laughter in China. And so he's going to start the program actually by talking a little bit about the history of comedy, and then they're going to sit down and have a conversation. I also just learned, I didn't even know, that Chris is an amazing linguist as well. So when the Chinese author Yu Pa came to America last year or not long ago, Chris was the translator for him. So he's an amazing Chinese speaker as well. Joe Schaefer lived in Shanghai for something like 11 years, I think, and is also an amazing Chinese speaker and an amazing comedian who founded in Shanghai Kung Fu Comedy and the People's Republic of Comedy. And he's a writer and he was a writer and performer in sketches for Mama Hu Hu. I love that name. He now lives in New York and he co-produces Kung Fu Comedy in New York City. And I hope you will all go see the performance tomorrow evening at, what is the location?
New York Comedy Club.
New York Comedy Club. Okay, so they're going to do an amazing show tomorrow. And finally, last but not least, we've got Norah Yang, who is from Shanghai, but spent only 2 years studying in the States, and her English is so good that she can do comedy in both English and in Chinese. So she does comedy in China. She started only 3 years ago. She's performed more than 700 shows in more than 15 cities across China, the US, Thailand, and Japan. So we're absolutely thrilled to have her here tonight too. So Chris, I'm going to hand it over to you, because Chris is going to do a little sort of intro, and then they're going to have a conversation. So come on up, please, Chris. Is you're going to have to use a mic, because we're taping the thing for posterity. So there you go. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, David, James, Jeremy, and Aaron. This is a fantastic and unique event.
You're going to have to hold, I'm sorry, but you're going to have to hold the mic up very close to your mouth.
Right next to this thing. Oh yeah, so if you're a bad audience. So I'm visiting here from Canada, which is a country located just north of the United States. And I have a PhD in humor studies, so they've invited me here to add a little bit of gravitas to this occasion. But also to try to put our discussion of what makes China laugh into a broader context. For example, I think we could consider equally valid questions like, of course, what makes China laugh, what made China laugh in the past and still does, what makes China laugh now, and what makes Canada laugh. So it's often said that China has 5,000 years of comedy, and we're going to go through all of it in the next 10 minutes, joke by joke. So history. Let's start with one of the earliest Chinese jokes from about the 3rd century. Right? A man of Lu, from the state of Lu, was trying to carry a bamboo pole through the city gates. First he tried to carry it through vertically, but he failed. So he tried horizontally, but he failed again. He was at a loss when this old man stopped by and said, "I'm no sage, but I've been around a bit. Why don't you try sawing the pole in half and bring it in that way?" And so he did. Now, if you didn't get that joke, you'll be happy to know that it came with a commentary, which was this: of all the dumb things in the world, nothing tops this. And to me, what this proves is that humorists are always closely followed by humor scholars. So let's jump ahead about 1,000 years to the Ming Dynasty, which was, I think, by far the funniest dynasty. The Ming gave us several picaresque novels, including a book of, I think, Divine Mischief, The Journey to the West, which features this anthropomorphic, magical monkey named Sun Wukong, definitely a name to remember. The Ming also saw this here's a modern version of Sun Wukong, Monkey King versus Transformer. But besides this, we also had this explosion in commercial publishing. So it used to be that reading was just for the snobby literati, but now you also had genre fiction, detective novels, and joke books. So I thought that you all being New Yorkers, you might appreciate a joke about real estate. So a man who liked peace and quiet had the misfortune to live between two blacksmiths, and the racket from their hammering pummeled his ears day and night, making him miserable. He was often heard to remark, if those two would just move, I would happily pay them in thanks. And so one day they showed up and said, guess what, we're moving. He said, fantastic. So he paid them and he treated them to a drink. And he said, so where are you guys moving to? And one said, I'm moving to his place and he's moving to mine. So that illustration comes from actually a 1937 edition of like a joke anthology that included a lot of old jokes. But if you're interested in kind of earlier Chinese visual humor, you have to go no further than the Met. Just a couple of days ago, went and saw an exhibition. So this dates back to 1757, and you can even find works of Chinese humor, visual humor, like sculpture of somebody losing a chest from the Han Dynasty. So I know you're all thinking, okay, maybe a joke or two was told during the last 2,000 years of imperial history, but what I really want to know is, do communists laugh? And I think an easy answer would be that some people would say they've been killing it for about 70 years now. They killed it during the Civil War, they killed it during land reform, they killed it again all the way up to the Cultural Revolution, and some of the displays we're beginning this year are suggesting, we can still kill it. But I think besides that, if you wondered, do communists have humor? The answer is blank. This is an image that appeared first in a Shenzhen newspaper. Right? This was a newspaper, a state-run newspaper in the south, and then it was picked up and circulated by the China Daily. And so this is actually suggests that the rulers of China know very well people need to be entertained. And in fact, they've known this for a very, very long time. Right? So you can see that these memes circulating. I don't know if it was a district chief from Gansu province who happened to carve these, if these are from abroad. But you still have jokes being circulated through the state media. And so I think this is really important to realize, because we often think of humor as being just a bottom-up grassroots thing. But in fact, use this kind of parallel tradition which interacts with the grassroots tradition of top-down humor. So you even see reworkings of the oldest jokes in the book for new things like production, right? So I think when people are, and you also have other types of things, back in the old days, Cold War adversaries, like really, really trenchant stuff. So there's really a fascinating and extremely diverse history of comedy in China. And I think that, when time is limited, like now people tell jokes, when they have a bit more time, they tell stories. And Yang Jiang, one of my favorite modern writers, during the Cultural Revolution, she and her husband were sent down to the countryside to essentially do agricultural labor and to be re-educated by the peasants. And she wrote in one of her memoirs, I just want to share a very brief excerpt from a memoir she wrote in the 80s, saying that the first thing that they had to do in the vegetable plot was to construct an outhouse. And so any passerby would use the outhouse and they would collect fertilizer. And for modesty's sake, they added a curtain to their privy. Right? And then the next morning, after they had built this thing and put on the curtain, they discovered not only was the curtain gone, but all of the waste was gone as well. And she said that this ended up being a recurring problem because, in her words, local wisdom had it that the waste produced by intellectuals was the best around. And Yang's husband, Qian Zhongshu, another one of my favorite writers, he was definitely a very bookish type. He larded both his stories and his literary criticism with, I think, similar types of wit and zingers. So there's a famous line by Alexander Pope, right, that tells us, "Let such teach others who themselves excel, and censure freely who have written well," which is a literary way of saying don't meddle in our internal affairs. But to Qian Zhongshu, he thought that this was like saying, before you must be a horse or a pig before you can be a good veterinarian. So I think this is an uncommon mind that speaks to concerns outside of China as well. So we'll talk a little bit more about kind of top-down versus bottom-down humor in the modern age. I just want to point out that the emperors of old also appreciated humor. So for example, who can tell me what is funny about this painting by a Ming Dynasty emperor? What's laughable about this? I'll take that as a no. But okay, you can look a little closer. I've got a dog wagging his tail there. It turns out that one variant of the character xiao is a dog under a bamboo radical, right? So this is what we have nowadays. But this is essentially a rebus, right? It's like a word game, so, for those in the know. And it turns out that this is not just ancient history. This is a game being played today in Japan, where there's a slightly different variant on it, right? We have, again, a dog under bamboo, same thing. When I came across this image on the net, I was thinking maybe the person didn't know how to spell. And it was under the dog, but then I realized, no, actually they're not just laughing, they are bowled over with laughter. Because if you turn xiao upside down, you're xiao dao. You have been bowled over with laughter. And in fact, this is a game you see in early Chinese, in modern Chinese humor anthologies, where we have the Forest of Laughs, early joke book upside down to show that we're bowled over with laughter. So this is why Chinese is so fun. Right? This is why Chinese is so fun. And political humor is certainly rife with puns. So we have this, one of the villains of modern Chinese history, Yuan Shikai. He was president of the Republic of China. He really wanted to be emperor. He did become emperor for about 83 days in 1916 before he died of illness. And from Yuan's era, we have a lot of caricatures of this guy, right? Very self-important military man. But we also have puns, because his name Yuan sounds like Yuan or ape. So we have all of these things about apes. This was kind of a meme of the print culture age. But very importantly, Sun Zhongshan, the father of the nation, even though he shares the same name with Sun Wukong, he is not a chimp. No one would ever suggest that. So there are still some limits to political humor and to punning in China. But what we can definitely say about this period is the modern era, you had the rise of a popular press that was very into humor and sold ridicule and laughter of all types. You also had the coining of the modern term for humor, or youmo, in 1924. This became a buzzword and is still one of the main terms that people use in China today. So there's a really interesting history of how we got to that moment. But tonight we're going to hear a little bit about performing comedy. I'm not a performing comic myself, but we have one here tonight. And the different types of comic performance that make China laugh. So for example, xiangsheng from Beijing and Tianjin was all the rage before the People's Republic, right? For decades, it was a really lively, modern, popular art form. And some actually interesting things changed after the founding of the People's Republic in 1949, where the state became a major patron of stand-up comedy, believe it or not. And so you had a new livelihood for many, many comics. The problem, of course, is you can get co-opted, and so the traditional comics would distinguish between their vegetarian fare, which is family-friendly, the sude, and then the hunde, the slightly meatier dishes for different sensibilities, or fleshier dishes, you could say. And Perry Link has written one classic of double entendre called The Birdie Won't Chirp, which maybe we can save for discussion. But one of the workarounds, and this is kind of the vegetarian fare that you would get, like practice good hygiene. Not terribly funny stuff. But one of the workarounds that people came up with in the 1950s was essentially at the comedy clubs, everyone would be chowing down on meat, so to speak. But if a cadre walked in, someone would stand up and start singing "The East is Red," and then everybody else would follow suit. So if anybody came in late, let's get you caught up on the 5,000 years of comedy. Essentially, the legendary three dynasties of antiquity were pretty funny thanks to the philosophers Confucius and Zhuangzi. We have the Qin dynasty where they burned books and buried scholars alive, which is not funny. Han Dynasty was very funny. Then we have these some other dynasties. Nobody really knows. It's anyone's guess. Tang Dynasty had a big rebellion in the middle, so it's not terribly funny. Song Dynasty is known for being more stuffy than funny. But then the Yuan Dynasty, of course, that's the Mongols. You should never laugh at a Mongol. The Ming Dynasty was extremely funny. The Ming Dynasty was extremely funny. As I mentioned, the Qing was rather bitter, but you do have a lot of jokes about Manchus, if you're interested. The Republic of China, I think, was pretty funny. The Mao era was about 70% funny, and 30% not funny. And then, of course, the post-Mao era is absolutely daft. So, I am a teacher. I'm going to leave you with some homework, which is, you see on the back of your sheet, there are some recommended readings for those who are curious. Viewings, if you like film or videos, including some featuring our participants, and studies if you're an academic like me. Okay, and there's also final examination. So, have you been paying attention? This is for a book giveaway, and Aaron's going to help me out here. So, be fast on your buzzer. Right, it is a school night. So this is for a copy of China's Chaplain, Comic Stories and Farces by Xu Zhuodai. And this is a book that features a Art Deco turkey. Since, as you all know, yesterday was
Canadian Thanksgiving.
Yes, well done. Which country, besides China, begins with a C and ends with a K? You get to decide who to give it to. Too fast on the buzzer.
This one?
That's the one. That's the one. Give him a round of applause. Okay, for a copy of the Age of Irreverence. Who am I? That's pretty fast.
It came from over there someplace, I think.
From over that way? Okay, over here. Give him a round of applause. Just two more chances. Two more chances. All right. So, for a copy of the Book of Swindles, which dynasty was the funniest?
Ming Dynasty.
No, the People's Republic of China.
You gotta call it. I heard a few over there. Well done.
Bravo!
Indeed, it was the late Ming. All right. And then for a human, beast, and ghost, whose waist is the best around?
Intellectual.
All right, that was over here. Bravo.
Back here.
For this last question, I want to call to the stage a very special Canadian. My mother, everybody. I'm going to hand out this last book here. This is the hardest question. But, as you've all noticed, I took an effort to dress up tonight. So I want to ask you, what does my necktie say? And here's, for those of you who can't see in the back. Right over here first. And what does that mean?
You can only dry wash.
Dry clean only. Thank you very much. So now you know that what makes China laugh is exactly the same as what makes Canada laugh. Novelty neckties. So you can go home now, or since you already know what makes China laugh, or you can stay with us. We're talking about grassroots humor, official humor, all kinds of humor, and what it's like being a stand-up comic in China today. So please join me in welcoming to the stage Norah and Jesse.
Yeah, can you each use mics, please, and hold them close to your mouth? You need to press, until the green light goes on, and then hold it close to your mouth.
Wait.
Good.
Not too loud. Yeah, sound
Oh,
time.
you are.
Hello.
Okay.
Cool. How's it going, everybody?
Fine.
All right.
We have this space really filled up.
Yeah.
All right. What makes China laugh? Well, let's start. I think I'm interested in hearing about your comedy journey, because you both have sort of mirror images of each other, right? Like you grew up in the West, presumably on stand-up, on SNL, that sort of stuff, and then you found Shangsheng, and now you're like what, you have to be the preeminent Western Shangcheng.
I don't know,
It's a big field, right?
There are not so many people doing it, so, you know, there's almost by definition at this point.
Right, awesome. And then Norah, you grew up with traditional Chinese comedy, Shangcheng.
Yes. So I grew up listening to Shangcheng before I sleep. I really like it. And then later on, I stopped liking it. I think it's too old tradition. And I started to like stand-up and started to do comedy. And then I realized, you know, Lao Wai is doing Shangcheng, and I'm still in Lao Wai's job. So it's a lot of fun.
Cool. So what about you? Like, I mean, what drew you to this traditional form of Chinese comedy, and what did you take from you, or what did you take with you from Western comedy and bring to that, or
Sure.
did you at all?
Well, I mean, my story, I'm originally from Boston, grew up outside the Boston area, and I had done improv comedy all throughout high school and college. It was what I did for fun. I also did a little bit of stand-up, but obviously watched a lot of stand-up and loved stand-up comedy when I was a kid. And when I studied abroad in China, I was doing these really intense Chinese language programs, or we had to learn 100 characters a day, and my brain was frazzled, and I realized that I was not getting a chance to do the comedy, and that was when I realized how much of a kind of stabilizing force laughter was for maintaining sanity in life. And so that got me interested while I was over in China, is what is the Chinese comedy like, because I had never thought of this before. And in addition to discovering the very fledgling Chinese improv and Chinese stand-up scenes, I learned about xiangcheng, the traditional northern Chinese comedy style. It's a lot like Abbott and Costello. You have two people on stage, there's a joker, there's a straight man, you go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. A lot of jokes, a lot of puns, wordplay, physicality, it's all there. And when I learned about this, I was instantly fascinated, because I had all this comedy feel from having done comedy in America, but everything was just slightly changed because it was in a new country and a new culture and a new style. And so that fascinated me. And then when I graduated from college, I was lucky enough to get a Fulbright fellowship to research this comedy for a year. So I apprenticed to a master comedy teacher, Ding Guangquan, who is the same master who taught Dashan and other foreigners how to do the traditional art form. And I expected I'd study with him for the duration of the fellowship, which was 1 year, and now 7 years later, I'm still doing comedy in China. So it was definitely one of the things that attracted me about it was that there was this, first of all, I had a fantastic teacher. I'd never had somebody who had done comedy for 50 years sit down with me and figure out how to do it well. And I think in America we have comedy mentorships, but the nature of the master-student relationship is different over there, and it was something that I had never had access to as a comedian or as a performer. So Master Ding would go over, not only going over the routines that we did with me, but also kind of training up how to connect with an audience, how to network with other people at a show. If you do a show, take this person's card, but then also make sure that you get their assistant's card, because their assistant's going to be the person who actually books you. They don't have time to talk to you. The assistant will actually book you. Like all sorts of stuff like that, which was, even if it had not been China, I would have been lucky to have a person with that experience. But then when it came to China, the idea of interacting with this art form that had over 100 years of history, and the fans of the art form of xiangcheng know xiangcheng so well, sometimes they even know the routine you're going to do before you do it. And on one hand, that's very stressful, because you like to be able to surprise people with material, but on the other hand, it was a really great experience to test the craft of telling jokes. Can you still make people laugh if they have an idea about what you're going to do, even if they don't know the word? And that was a challenge we just don't face in the Western culture, because in stand-up everybody will write their own original pieces. Whereas in xiangcheng you adapt traditional pieces, or you can write your own out of nothing, but a lot of times we would study the adaptation of traditional pieces and then how to make them feel real now by incorporating modernity into the older pieces. So those challenges were not something that I had to deal with in stand-up before, and the challenge of doing that in another language and another culture was just super fun.
Yeah, I mean, in Western stand-up, I mean, innovation is paramount. I mean, what we call, if you do something that maybe gets a laugh, but it still feels stale and old, it's what we call hack comedy, right?
So this is one of the most interesting things about, especially when it comes to stand-up, like hacky comedy. It's been done before. In crosstalk, the audience is not judging by that standard. So they want to see how you do the joke. They're less concerned with what you say as much as how do you do it, and do you bring your own life and energy into that joke. Whereas if you watch a stand-up show, even in China, they'll be more concerned about what topics you chose and what you picked. But then, I don't know, your experience in doing the stand-up as well, one of the things that's been interesting to me about doing the Chinese stand-up is that a lot of the audience, if you ask them who's ever been to a stand-up show, almost nobody has been to a stand-up show, like a live stand-up show in China. So stuff that to the Western stand-up palette is super hack, nobody's done before in China. So even if it's just like men and women are different, people really seem to like it there because they've never seen it before. And so I think maybe in 5 years, stuff that we're doing now might seem really old, but now at least it seems like people are still really into it. I don't know what your experience is.
So you coming from the opposite direction, what does it feel? You have all that weight, hundreds of years of tradition with Shang and this rote sort of aspect of it, and then did you? At what age did you discover stand-up, and what was the appeal? Was it? I want to hear about that.
So my story with stand-up was very short, very brief. I started stand-up like 3 years ago, and before I've seen it online, but I did not know that you can be just doing open mic and become a comedian. So I always thought you have to be trained. So my first experience was when I was in Hong Kong, and I was watching a show, and there was a white guy on stage, and he was like, "Is there an American of those?" And people were like, "Ooh, Australian of those, ooh," everybody's drunk. And then he's like, "Any Chinese in the house?" And I was the only Chinese in the room, so I was like, "Ooh," and nobody was with me. So the guy was like, "Okay, you're alone, I'm gonna do a Chinese joke." So he did a joke, and as you can tell, it will be racism. And but everybody laughed, and I have to laugh because it's funny. And after the show, there was this cocktail party, and I was tipsy with my friend, and then the comedian walked over to me, and he was like, "You're the girl from China, right?" I was like, "Yes." He's like, "Okay, stand-up is about an art form of being offensive, but it's not personal to you, so I want to apologize if it makes you feel uncomfortable." And then, as you can tell from the story, that I was drunk by the time he asked me the question. So I just, rose back. And my friend said it was hilarious, but I could not remember. My friend was like, "You were so hilarious, people come over and started applauding for you." And I was like, "Wow, that must feel good, but I cannot remember it." But then anyway, the comedian was like, "Okay, Norah, you're great. Do you want to do the open mic?" And I was like, "I moved back to Shanghai." So he introduced me to Kung Fu Comedy Club. And then I started to do English stand-up. And I remember, that's how I started stand-up. And I find it to be fascinating because stand-up is so personal. Unlike crosstalk, as Jesse said, that there's a lot of patterns that people can do the same material, but with different techniques. But stand-up is just to yourself. So I find it fascinating because it's so personal. I can be myself, and I can do what I do. I can be mean, and people will laugh at it, and people will pay for me. Afterwards, that's really great. So I started to do it, but then I realized it's also very difficult because the first time I remember, I always think myself as a funny person. So the first time I go to open mic, I did not prepare at all. I was like 5 minutes, I'm gonna make them laugh their heads off. And I come to stage, it was a lineup of all the male comedians before me, and all of them are like white people. No offense to white people, but it's just how it is. So I go up to stage and I was like, "Okay, people, you've been hearing story from on the other side of the wall. Now it's a Chinese girl telling you what to do." And all the drunk people sober up. I remember their hands were on the drinks, but then they heard that, they're like, "Oh, this is aggressive woman." So they sober up, nobody laughed for the 5 minutes, and I was so sad. I was like, "I am not supposed to be on stage, I'm horrible at this." And then other comedians, they came to comfort me, and they told me it's so usual that you will be, like that for the first time. And then I realized, stand-up is not that easy. It's not as easy as it seems. So you still have to have techniques. You have to prepare for it. But again, the difficulty also make it to be more interesting because when I get better, I realize not everybody can do it. So I'm one of the few people in China that can do it, and that keeps me going on until now.
All right, so I think the lesson there that every comedian knows is always record your sets, right? So you don't forget them. All right. Wonderful. So yeah, you're both outsiders performing for a different culture in New York. I say that as a compliment. I mean, just to speak, I feel like we each occupy 3 corners of this sort of cross-cultural performance, because my own story is I performed at Kung Fu Comedy as an expat, primarily to other expats in that very particular world, which now having moved back to New York, I realized was like comedy on easy mode. Because at the core of comedy is finding these universal truths that resonate with these other people. And we were all living in this very particular situation. We were all these Westerners in this culture, and finding out those commonalities was so easy. It was so easy to get a laugh. And then I moved back here, and I'm like, "Hey, what's the universal truth?" And they're like, "We all think you suck." That's what we all agree on. It's hard. New York is hard, but one thing, the one lesson I remember that I learned earliest on was as an expat in this mysterious, inscrutable country, China, was that there's a lot of obviously like frustrations and quirky things that you want to talk about and laugh about, and one of the earliest things I learned was that there's a very fine line between joking about something and really taking a giant crap on it. And like when you come out and you were making a joke and it came across as negative, like you were attacking or criticizing China, it would not get a laugh. It leaves a bad taste in your mouth. Like you don't have to go far as an expat to hear some other expat moaning about how hard his life is, and it's like, what? Our life here is awesome. Go back to Minnesota and eat fried cheese curds or whatever you have left. And so it's so easy. It's all perspective, right? I mean, this thing. Like I remember one of my first jokes was about being in China and people pushing in front of you a line or something like that. And instead of, that could easily be some rant about like, oh, why do people do that? But instead I flipped it and I'm like, China's made me tough. I go back to America and I see how coddled everybody else is there, I'm this like tough guy. So it's always easy to sort of flip stuff around and make it a celebration instead of a criticism. That was one of the first lessons I learned. But I want to hear about, you guys, what lessons you learned as outsiders performing. Like I know we've talked about this before. This particular phenomenon of trying to perform. You performed on TV, on the Chinese version of SNL, etc. And what challenges you face and what advantages you had as an outsider to the.
Sure. Well, I mean, the immediate advantage of being someone like me in America doing comedy there's almost nobody else that looks like me doing comedy. So from the very first moment, people are very interested in what's going to happen. A lot of comedy is trying to sit in this moment of the audience has some idea of what's going to happen next, but they don't know how it's going to happen. So just being a white person speaking Chinese on stage, the audience has some idea maybe where this is going to go, but they don't really know, which is actually a pretty good place to be doing comedy from. The downside is that people inherently expect they're not going to relate to my experience. So they are preconceived to think, oh, your life may be interesting, but it's not going to be like mine. Which is not a good place to be doing comedy from, because I want to come out and say, isn't it so rough when blah, blah, blah happens? If I go on and I say like, oh, I was on the subway yesterday and I saw something crazy, people would think, oh, what does the foreigner think would be crazy on the subway? Which is not what I'm setting up at all. And so then I would have to say an extra sentence of, no, and this is something that doesn't have to do, it just gets complicated very quickly. So it's kind of a trade-off. It just means it's different. It's apples and oranges. it has meant, I was on a knockoff version of SNL where every week we had a new celebrity guest, and we had we had to write sketches, first table read, second table read, all that sort of stuff. I mean, the immediate thing of being the outsiders, I didn't know who any of the celebrities were. I found out later that's also because we were getting such low-tier celebrities. None of the Chinese people knew who they were too. Or they knew like, oh, I remember listening to her when I was 5, and I'm like, oh no. So that did make it a little bit difficult because I'm like, okay, they're like a pop star, but like a vague pop star. So it was difficult to write. But then also I found out that similar to a lot of troubles that minorities in America have getting onto shows, if there was a character that they needed a white person, like they needed somebody to play Mark Zuckerberg, I was in. But if they were not looking for that person, if I wrote, even in the sketches I wrote, if I wrote a character that could be played by a Chinese person, I would just find myself getting miscast. They'd be like, yeah, that sketch works, but I wouldn't wind up getting on stage. And the whole reason I started writing Chinese comedy is because I knew no movie would come along looking for a white comedian to do Chinese comedy, so I had to learn how to write if I ever wanted to be in anything. So it was this weird balance of I had to write for me, but the show is 200 people all working in the same direction. I can't push my way into the society to appear in roles that don't exist here. But I also can't not push, or else I'll wind up being recast. So that was sort of the challenge of things that had roles in them. But this is also why I like stand-up. Stand-up, if I say I'm me, and I talk about my life, people believe it, because that's my life, and then the next comedian will talk about their life. So it can be a challenge to figure out what parts of your life, even though you're different, at the end of the day, as a comedian, you want to connect with the audience. So even if my life may appear to be different in a lot of ways, it's very similar to many other people who are living in China. And part of my challenge here in coming back and doing shows in America is that my life is far more similar to a mainland Chinese person in the audience than it would be to an American of my age in the audience. I moved to China when I'm 22. I haven't lived in this country as an adult. My idea of what's going on in America is basically what I can see on the internet. And the internet is a crazy place. So I ironically feel like, in many ways more nervous about doing stand-up here in English in New York than I would be back in Beijing where I live, and I know the neighborhood and I kind of can hear what's funny. And so I'm kind of this weird double outsider now, but I did it to myself, so I guess I can't complain. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think added to that, also experiencing this, having lived my entire adult life in China and then coming back here, it's like that unfamiliarity with the culture paired with me also being old, which also makes me like have no idea. Yeah. I don't know any of the slang, any of the celebrities, but I'm like, how about that 50 Cent? Yeah. I think he was hot when I left. Can we talk about him? Like,
we're all in the club today.
Yeah. It's my birthday. All right, Norah, let's hear your experience as an outsider. I mean, first of all, like how much performance do you do to Western audiences versus Chinese audiences? Because you do both, right?
Yeah, so I do both stand-up in Chinese and in English. And for Chinese, it's like 99% of Chinese audience. There is also 1% of what we call the expat or foreigners. They're trying to learn Chinese culture, but they end up not laughing at all. So, but they usually get picked on and be laughed at. Because they go, oh, there's a guy, in the audience. Why are you in the Chinese show? And he'll be like, I can only say one sentence. My name is Andolu, and that's it. That's everything. But then for the English shows, the audience is usually 70% of expat and then 30% of Chinese audience at most. So it's still a very good, mixed.
And those are like haigui, right? Like they're familiar.
Yeah, for the Chinese audience of the English shows, they are mostly like, educated abroad, or they speak very good English, so then they want to come and enjoy the authentic stand-up. And then as an outsider, I'll just focus on my, experience as an English comedian. I think as Jesse said, I also get a lot of advantage because I would say like I'm the only active bilingual comedian female in China, the only one. If you count the other guy, so that would be like 1 or 2. So that gives you a lot of advantages. Like people will be like, oh my god, this is so new perspective. Because perspective means a lot for your material as a comedian. So if your perspective is different, is fresh, people usually get to be more curious and more interested. And then, but that's in Shanghai or in China. I also performed a couple times in the US before in the last year, and I realized that's even more, like my advantage kind of expands or strengthens when it came to US. But because I realized US people actually don't know about Chinese. Like, I remember I was in the US performing last year. I was in Texas, Austin, and then one of the audience, they were talking to me, and they were even surprised that I know Google and Facebook. I was like, I'm educated, so what's the problem? They're like, oh, you must be one of the smartest people in China. I was like, all people in China with VPN are smartest by your definition. So, and then I also like bump into other audience. I also performed in Burning Man last year, 2 years ago. And then people were just flooding to me after the show. They were like, you were amazing. You know, I was in China last year. I really love Tokyo. It's like, I was like, where are you from? They're like, I'm from Canada. I was like, yeah. New York's a good city too. So like things like that just keep happening, which made me feel that, you know, it's my responsibility to kind of do stand up and make people actually know a bit of what real China is. So when I was performing in the States, like people actually were more embracing and more celebrating because they find it to be so real. And the Chinese comedian that you can see in the States or in the Western world, a lot of them are like second generation Chinese, so they have not really lived in China before. So when I came, I also got questions of, oh, are you a ABC, American born Chinese? I'm like, thank you for the compliments of my English, but I'm born and raised in China. And they will be just mind blowing. They'll be, how did you get out of the country? I'm like, by visa. So like, they just have a lot of questions, and I'm just very thrilled. And I think there's a long way to go, but I'm really happy that I'm doing what I'm doing.
Excellent. Well, we're talking about different cultures. I'm sure we all have an example of a joke that lands to a Chinese audience, but to a Western audience doesn't land at all. I think that's very fascinating. Do you guys have any examples of that, of having to, or reworking a joke, finding ways to tweak it to appeal to these different sensibilities?
I mean, one thing that's very clear is just like terminology. Like in America, there are different sensitive issues than there are in China. So in America, if I were even just to go on the show and I start out by talking about, oh, so I met some black people, and then people in America are like, how's he gonna do this? I'm not gonna leave right now, but everybody's just, okay, and they're just waiting. But if I were just in a Chinese show and I saw, if I was saying like, 我在什么，我家附近我走过了一个黑人，然后我跟他说, no Chinese people would be upset or worried about that at all. They'd just be like, okay, you're describing what happened. Because that's not where the social pressure point is. But if I were talking about, even doing something like doing an interview about getting my Chinese visa or something like that, people would then say, well, if I were interviewing with the American government about the American visa, I would expect this would be a very sensitive thing for you. So basing their definition of what they would think would be sensitive onto my body, then they would say this is something that maybe I should be sensitive about, when actually I was not concerned at all about said interview. So there are sensitive things that work, or even things like, for instance, I remember trying to do a joke about there are foreigners that date Chinese people. And this is a very common circumstance in China. So in the Chinese joke, I would just start by talking about, I've noticed a lot of foreigners dating Chinese people, and then I would get that, I got like a little bit of the straightening up, and it wasn't that I couldn't talk about it. It wasn't that people weren't interested. It was just that I realized, like, oh, this was just the setup for me. But actually, it came a little bit quick for people, and maybe I should have an intro joke into this, whether it's even funny or not, to sort of get people into a topic matter. And then of course things change. I had a whole bunch of jokes I do about basketball because it was super safe. It was like the safest topic I could think of to talk about how me and my friends would, not anymore. I had a whole bunch of jokes about the Celtics, I knew that Chinese people love basketball, so I prepared some Celtics gear for my Chinese friends, and I noticed the Celtics, they have green shorts and green shirts and green hats. So Chinese people, in Chinese, if you wear a green hat, it means you've been cuckolded. So I would make a joke about how I was bringing all these green hats. I'm like, one for you, one for you. And so now this joke, which was funny because it was super innocent, I don't think I can do it anymore. So that would be an experience of a joke that maybe is, because the environment shifts around me, now that kind of joke would also change.
Yeah, the basketball stuff.
Yeah, basketball stuff's
Just got radioactive.
Yeah, I gotta wait 4 years to try it again. Once they start airing the games again, I can probably do it.
Same question to you. Are there any particular jokes that you that crush in front of a Chinese audience, and then the Westerners just take it?
Yeah, there's a lot. I can think of actually an example which is the other way around. Like I did a joke in English. I said that like the trade war is really doing bad on the movie industry because now we cannot enjoy the Marvel movies. Because of the trade war, there will not be Iron Man. It will just be man. I think it's like super smart. I love it, and then I just translated back to Chinese, and people know about Marvels, people know about Iron Man, but then Chinese audience like, you're right, Trump is dumb, and that's it. So they don't find it funny, they find it to be factual. So I'm like, can you laugh instead of like, I agree with you, like just this is not where I'm going. So yeah.
I have found though that one way you can get around that sort of like sensitivity is you have to surprise people with the punchline. So if I went on stage and I was saying, like, 这个北京的空气太差了，我受不了了, like the air in Beijing is horrible, I can't stand it. This would be just a normal setup in English. This is getting the opinion out and the direction out. But in China, even though everybody in the audience would agree with me, they're like, this is not your place to say that the air is bad. Even though everybody knows. But if you say something like, my parents keep, instead I do a joke and say, like, my parents keep asking me when, like, what's your plan? What's your plan? And when are you coming back? And I have to tell them, like, look, as China, everything changes really fast. Like, I can't see the future. I mean, I can't even see across the street. So, if you do that, then you could do that in Chinese and people laugh too because they think it's a joke about my mom asking when I'm moving home, which I'm totally allowed to talk about. And then you kind of hit people, and then laughter, the fun thing about laughter is if you actually get it, you can't fake it. So that also, by the same definition, means you can't suppress it if you actually come at it from an angle that people are not expecting. But if you give people the time with setting up, I'm going to be talking about A, and A is very hard because blah, 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 and I give you the time to set up. If you are sensitive, you'll start to become sensitive. Something chemically literally happens with your body, and then nothing's funny anymore.
You can feel it too.
Yeah.
I mean, you can feel an entire audience pull back, and you really stepped in it.
Yeah. So, I mean, and then as a comedian, the best you can probably do then is being like, I sense discomfort in the room, or something like that, which is probably not going to be a great way of doing things, but, it's probably better than just bullying along with the joke, even though it's going to ruin the rest of your set.
I have like one just quick observation that as a Chinese doing English, I have to do real material to make people laugh. But to be honest, I think Jesse's material is really smart. He's not just doing hacky ones. I've seen some like expats, because when the Laowai speak Chinese, people already find it funny. You don't even have to make sense. You can just go onto stage and then just curse. Like in Chinese, you'd be like, shit. And people are like, oh, this Laowai can curse in Chinese. It's so amazing. Yeah, they would be laughing for like a long time.
I found if I...
So not fair, I cannot do that.
Yeah, I found that if I paused at the wrong time, sometimes I'll just get laughs for stuff that doesn't even make any sense. Like, I would say like, you know, 我昨天看了一条微博, like I saw something on Weibo, like Chinese version of Twitter, 我昨天看了一条微博. If I stop there, I might get a laugh. Because they think that I think it's funny that I know what Weibo is, and they'll give you the like, oh, okay, we're trying to help you. You know, they feel like they're doing their job as the audience by laughing where they think I'm going to let them laugh. But in actuality, the problem is it kills your persona as a performer. I don't want my persona to be like, I know how the red lights work in the city. The red lights are the stoplights and the green lights are the go lights. Everybody knows this. But if people thought that that was supposed to be interesting and you stop there, you might get a laugh. So what I learned pretty quickly is I have to plow through those moments and kind of with the comedy technique to show people that's not the joke. 这边昨天看了一个微博，我觉得非常有意思，就是 you know, I plow right through the point where I say, I saw something on Twitter the other day and it was really interesting. I don't stop at Twitter and seem like you want to get that laugh. But it's very frustrating because I could stop there and I will sometimes see foreign comedians that on, you know, not necessarily even comedians, but we'll say entertainers on TV. There are a lot of foreigners that will go on TV and they'll get the laugh that's kind of the easy laugh. And it's not a fake laugh. People are, I guess, genuinely amused. But it doesn't make me happy. And it's like, whatever's wrong with my head that makes me want to do comedy anyway doesn't get happy from doing that. So so finding a way to get stuff through is really important. Like, well, I have a technique. I don't know if you do this. But there are certain things that foreigners in China are not supposed to know. Like, for instance, I would do like a joke. For instance, the actress Fan Bingbing was caught, like, you know, evading taxes. And for a while, she just disappeared. So this is a hot topic, and I've always had so much trouble doing hot topic jokes in China. Because in China, the fact the foreigner knows about the hot topic is the joke. That's the whole joke. Like, nobody really wants to know what I think happened to Fan Bingbing.
Celebrities are fair game.
Yeah, celebrities are generally politically fair game, but just like as a setup sort of thing, nobody's like, oh, what's he really going to say? Everybody thinks the joke is that. So I would have to invent fake Chinese friends of mine that happen to be talking about this subject, so that the Chinese audience knows I didn't bring it up myself. Yeah, so I would be like, so I was chatting with my Chinese friends and they mentioned the actress Fan Bingbing. Apparently she had like tax evasion fraud and she just disappeared. And I thought, that's very interesting. But I just introduced that in a way that's totally not interesting. And so now you're listening to the second half of the joke. But if I hadn't introduced that my Chinese friends have been talking about it, all the Chinese people would be thinking is like, how does he know that? That's so funny. Did you know that he knew that? And they don't hear the second part of the joke. So,
that's
you invent fake American people? Or am I crazy?
Dumb Americans around her to just use, right? You don't need to get any.
There's also like two small things. One is that like if especially like Jesse's Chinese is really good, but if your Chinese is not good, and when a like foreigner comedian is doing a joke, and then his accent might also get a laugh.
Yeah.
People like, he's like, there's no punchline at all. People are like, he mispronounced the word, what a gorilla. So people find it to be really funny. So you can imagine our perspective as a Chinese audience to see a foreigner comedian on stage as how you would observe a chimpanzee in a zoo. So if a chimpanzee can do any tricks, even if using chopstick, we find it to be fascinating. Yeah. It doesn't have to be using chopstick to write a joke. No, just chopsticks.
I kind of feel like I'm like a pool player who's like a double amputee, and I figured out this really clever way to use my foot to shoot the pool balls. And like, it took a long time to learn how to do it, and now I just want to play pool. But everybody else is like, how does he do that? Like, you know, and so it feels, but I oftentimes will say to people, like, as a comedian, it's like if you're a chef, you want to know your food is the food was tasty. You don't want people to hear like, wow, you cut those foods so quickly. The language ultimately is for a comedian is a tool. It's like if I speak the language and I have something in my head and I think it's funny and I want to get into your head, if I have the language, I can do that. But the language itself is a means to an end, or at least it should be. And it's part of the challenge of 40 years of portrayal of foreigners in Chinese media, that the show has been about the fact that the foreigners speak Chinese, not about the content that's being said. And so I kind of feel here, where in China, I sometimes have to work against that 40 years of what has been in the Chinese media, foreigners performing, and when people say, oh, your Chinese is very good, and then they say, oh, 没有, nani, sort of, and not make it about that.
Well, that's kind of what fascinates me about the position you both occupy as outsider, because it is, I know, something that you could very easily lean on. I mean, the famous case in American comedic history is like Yakov's mirror. Remember that guy? I mean, his entire persona is built around like, I'm Soviet man, America is crazy, and then the Soviet Union fell, and there went his career. It's like how much do you hitch your wagon to that? Because ultimately, it's like, where do you want to take this, right?
Well, so this is part of the challenge for me. I'd be interested in hearing your perspective as well. Part of as I've done comedy longer and longer, it's been a little bit bizarre to see that even as I think I get better and my jokes get better, the audience's way that they parse my performance hasn't changed that much. And so the answer to that question might be completely out of my control. So there's I think luckily, whereas the world continues to expand, the United States and the Soviet Union had very few connections between them, whereas China and America have many connections between them. There's probably some sort of place for all four of us, in the big world somewhere, but it may be constantly changing as that sort of thing evolves.
This is kind of the new to you problem.
Yeah.
China is not new to you if you've been living there many years, but you will constantly be new to other people who are seeing you for the first time, and hearing you speak for the first time.
Yeah.
But one of the reasons I find studying the history of this comedy so interesting is because you do start to see patterns where a lot of what you see going on today is not necessarily new. And you have active government censorship of, maybe they can't touch that periodical because it's in the foreign concessions, but you can ban the post office from distributing it across China. Or you even have bilingual comedians, at least rewritten comedy, and on the lecture circuit in China in the 1930s. And they get criticized from both sides as well. And so they're in a very precarious position. So I think that it's interesting, they'll be said that they're just pandering stereotypes, right? Sending out stereotypes on both sides. And they're kind of inauthentically representing these different categories. But a lot of them made really successful careers, and were constantly, some of the most, they had the best grasp of language of anybody around. And so they were extremely witty, and they were often trying to just kind of break through these language games. Right? That example I gave before about why do we need a new word for humor in China in 1924? Well, because Lin Yutang had a good point. There was 笑话 and 真经话. There are two types of hua, there are two types of speech that are incompatible. So could you have anything that blends the two? So he felt like he had to come up with a completely new word. But you get new words now too, right? Gao xiao. No one was talking about gao xiao. It's just like a verb for getting things done, to bring about laughter. To gao xiao.
Or even脱口秀. Could you explain the 脱口秀and the stand-up has been translated because it's a fun
I think it's just because it's easier to remember. So 脱口秀 actually translated to talk show. It's different from stand-up, but it's so easy to remember. And then we started off with that, so people would just be too lazy to re-educate the audience, and then they would just be using that talk show as the representation for stand-up. However, recently we have been trying to introduce this new word, 单口喜剧, to represent stand-up, which is more accurate. But still, people even don't know what it is. It's you have to remember two words, so it's still kind of a misusing between now and then.
I mean, it's crazy having done comedy for so long, but when I got there, I didn't really realize how nothing the word stand-up meant. Stand up. What does it mean? Somebody standing?
My favorite is at work. My coworkers would be like, "Oh, what are you doing?" I'm like, "I'm doing a performance." And so, like stand-up comedy, they're like, "Oh, you and another person?" I'm like, "No, it's just one person." They're like, "What's the theme?"
Yeah.
Like, well,
it's so, like, what stand-up is, and part of the reason why America has such a great stand-up history is because when we say stand-up, people here know what it means. And that's incredibly important. And it's something that's really, 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 really hard to get to work somewhere else. Because, like, stand-up, when you go over, for me, like, stand-up, one person, pretty basic. You have to you have to have something to say. Like, even, I guess in theory, if you wrote down humorous content and read it, it could be stand-up, but that's not what people generally think about stand-up. It's like, I got something to say. I'm the type of person that likes going up with a mic and telling what I think. And generally, we have, again, our own ideas in stand-up about what it means to steal a joke. First of all, you shouldn't be stealing jokes. That's not included in the word stand-up. That's a social construct that has to be created or accepted somehow. And all of these things kind of come together to create this art form in America that we call stand-up. And a lot of the fun that I have in doing stand-up is because of those elements. But, Liaoning province TV station that has heard the word talk show, and wants to get hits on their website, doesn't know any of these things when they invite people from our scene to perform on their talk show program. In the early days of talk show, people thought it was like a Letterman show, a talk show, and we would go up on one person and they'd be like, "Where's the guest?" They're like, "This is a talk show, right?" And none of those people had seen a live talk show either. So
my favorite, I worked at a TV station, and they did like documentaries on like pottery and stuff, all this old stuff, and they found out I did comedy, and one of my coworkers came up and she was like, "Okay, so you write comedy, write a 5-minute hilarious intro to Ming Dynasty pottery." And I was like, "There's literally nothing funny about that." She's like, No, the ink they used, they called it, like, it was black, but then over time it turned blue.
Yeah.
Well, there you go. That's 5 minutes.
You don't even need me, just right there.
Like when I started, like my parents didn't know about this, and I don't want them to know about this. But later on, I have to tell them, so I kind of explain it as tell jokes. So my parents are like, "Wow, so you go to a bar every night, tell jokes to expats. You just entertain people every night. That sounds very dangerous." And I did not get paid, so my parents were very worried. It's not until some of the TV shows of stand-up becoming popular in China, and then they watch the TV shows, and then they realize what stand-up is. But still, they kind of confuse it with one-man 相声, because they thought that's very similar, but it's not. So I had to convince my dad that I don't have to wear traditional Chinese daguan to do 相声. I don't have a shifu, and the story is real. Like a lot of things my dad don't understand. And then also the words that we use is also very different. For example, like in Chinese we said you killed it, it's like 演炸. But then 演炸 in English is balmy, means you did it super bad. It's totally different. So everything is different. And as Joe was saying, like the whole environment did not know about it. So I have a daytime job, and my boss, when he heard that I do stand up, and he was like, "Okay, we have an annual party that you're gonna host it, and then I'll give you a script because we have a lot of lineups." And then he's like, "The script is just for comedians. You're perfect for the position." I took off the script. For every other 30 minutes, he said, "Be funny here."
That's a good lesson for anybody. If you ever get into comedy, one of the most important rules: never ever tell anybody you work with that you're doing it. That is key.
Yeah.
You will regret it.
But listen, 相声, a lot of it is highly scripted, right? And it's like a virtuoso performance, and like you've got it down. You've memorized the tongue twister, you've practiced it a million times, and you've done 700 shows now. So you must have at least built up a repertoire of anecdotes, and what lands and what doesn't. But it's not exactly the same as a canon joke. I mean, a lot of the jokes that I study is stuff that's been written down, so it's like a canon, and it's it's an amber, so to speak. And there are good jokes in there, and some of them were transmitted dynasty to dynasty because they're good. But There's a lot of chaff as well.
Well, that's another thing where like people are like, oh, well, did the joke not work because of Chinese culture? Blah blah blah. 9 out of 10 times a joke fails because it's not a good joke. Like,
blame the culture for your crappy joke.
That's the thing, is like people think the reason the joke worked has to be something mysterious that's ununderstandable. No, you didn't tell a good joke. The joke isn't good, doesn't connect with the audience. That's far more likely to be the reason why things do or don't hit. Maybe the joke would be funny if you told it, but I'm not the right person to tell it. Or maybe the audience just feels it's inauthentic. These could far more likely be the reason that the joke works than like, oh, the Chinese culture doesn't like that idea. It's because again, the audience is full of many different types of people, and I've found, I don't know about your experience, but my experience of meeting people from other cultures is that the difference between any two people is likely to be larger than the average distance between two cultures.
Sure.
So if somebody does or doesn't do something, it's most likely because of how they work, not necessarily because of the giant overarching cultural structure that we came from.
Sure.
It's not to say that the cultures don't have differences, but if I tell a joke, it might just not hit for this room. And it didn't hit for this room because it didn't hit for this room. Not because, oh, New Yorkers don't like that joke. No, I don't know. You guys could be from anywhere.
All right. Well, speaking of audiences, let's open this up to you guys.
Sure.
We'll do a little Q&A. Do anybody have any questions?
I have a question. Are people, comedians in China, permitted to make jokes about the situation between mainland China and Hong Kong?
Hong Kong jokes.
So, censorship, something we didn't touch on, and that's what everyone wants to know about. Absolutely not. Jokes. That would be politics.
Well, I don't know.
Would you go on stage right now and crack a joke about?
I think everything is related to the scale of what you're doing. If we're in a room with 2 people, it's fine. If
Turn off the cameras, please.
I run a small comedy club that seats 50 people. We don't film the shows. We tell people not to film the shows so they don't get out. I probably wouldn't be thrilled if somebody did like half an hour of this stuff, but if you make one joke, it's not going to be a problem. But you're not going to make a career doing that sort of stuff. And if you are doing those sorts of jokes in a place that people are looking to find the next big talent, you could do 5 really great jokes, and if you have a joke that's just that's not going to lead to better career progression, you just might not get picked. So as almost like a natural selection tactic, the types of people who would even think to make that joke just don't wind up making a career in comedy in China.
Well, I mean, just not even career. I mean, in our club, the rule was just don't touch politics, and it was mostly because you're not risking your own career. You're risking the entire comedy scene. I mean, our club did eventually get shut down by the government, but certainly, I mean, I think that was just it got too big and too much exposure. But yeah, it was like as a community, we're like, look, there's so much stuff to joke about. Just don't joke about that because you're really putting the entire scene at risk. It's selfish, and there were, in terms of censorship, in my experience, like politics was the one radioactive thing. You talk about anything else. I mean, I never felt stifled creatively. I'm not a political comedian, even here. But yeah, I wouldn't venture in there. It's just too, like we were saying before, like the audience, it's too charged. Like the audience would pull back, and people there's a sense of paranoia there that I think would be stifling for laughter.
What do you think, Norah?
Yeah, I definitely agree. So first of all, for me, I'm not a very politically sensitive person, so I don't really talk about that. And also, Joe has a great point that it's just if one thing happened, then the whole thing get affected. And then the industry is so new, and we just want more people to know about it first before it gets down forever in China. So we really wanted to avoid. And plus, I've heard people make political jokes, and the thing is, because they're super new in stand-up period, they cannot handle this topic. This topic actually requires a lot of technique and skill set. So they just say it without being funny. You get punished and you did not get people laugh. It's like nothing good come of it.
Yeah. And then to the same extent, just like this, just like in America, race or other issues would make people just not get comfortable. Politics has a similar effect oftentimes in China because The comedians don't have experience selling the joke. The audience doesn't have experience listening to it. So the audience is not necessarily going to think something's funny, or maybe the right medium for that is not a live show. Maybe it's some meme on the internet where people are maybe used to discussing this. But in a live show, it can sometimes be one of those things that people just get upset or uncomfortable, and it just makes it hard to really make people laugh. And at the end of the day, we all do comedies, we want to make people laugh. If we want to do like serious political stuff, we'd probably be writing political papers or doing IR.
But again, you're talking about like live comedy. There's also tweets. There's also Weibo.
There's so many ways to do comedy.
Yeah, small things and
live show.
All right.
Over here, back here.
I wanted to ask, how much heckling is there? What's the audience environment like?
What's your experience with heckling?
So for Chinese stand-up, like audience are very polite, so they don't drink during comedy. They drink water or non-alcoholic stuff.
I run a club and it drives me crazy. They do not drink.
Because
all of my calculations were based off of one drink for every other ticket.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because in America, that is literally how all the clubs are run. It's alcohol sales, make everything run.
Yeah.
And in China, you have to come up with an entire different system because, you can't make a lot of money with the juice sales. It's just not routine.
And that's why there's no almost heckling in Chinese, but there is heckling in English when people get drunk. And I get heckled and just like yelling, I don't even know what he's saying. And then the security would just pass them out because it kind of really ruins everything.
Yeah. I would say for the Chinese hecklers, I found that people are almost never will you be talking and somebody will shout out. But if you try to do crowd work and you're not confident and you run into a wise guy in the crowd and you picked on him first, he feels no problem about unloading on the comedian because he's like, I was just sitting here and you want to come here and do lousy crowd work? Okay. And if you hit one of those people, it winds up looking like heckling because a lot of the talk is going this way. But that was probably the fault of the comedian who set that up and tried to do it in the first place. We have a lot of questions.
I have read over the years that there's a very close similarity between American humor and Chinese humor, perhaps closer than any other non-Chinese civilization. Is there any truth to that?
I don't know. What do you think? Do you feel like the American humor is more Chinese than any other type of humor?
I would say that there's still difference, especially the cultural background. The references are very different. And now that I think it should be. If it's similar, it's only because I think we watch a lot of American comedy movies, and that kind of will influence our interpretation of comedy or as in humor. So for example, my dad is a pure Chinese, and then he would just tell me that he think in the American way being funny is when you tell a joke, tell a punchline, and then you say, My dad's like, that is the American way of being funny, and then he did that to me. So yeah.
I'd like to answer part of that question because again, I work on period 100 years ago. So it's all old jokes and it's all other people's jokes. It's not my jokes. But what I've found is that there's lots of evidence of tons of traffic between Europe, US, and China and Japan. So it's the publishers back in the 1930s, they didn't care where the joke came from. They didn't care where the funny story came from. They would translate it in like crazy, and they would laugh at it. So, the watermelons that I was showing, who knows where those really came from? But I think they work in China as well as elsewhere too. So I think there are some common grammars and vocabularies that do work well.
We have a lot of questions. Who's
in
charge of the questions?
I'll be in charge. My man right here, go for it.
Thank you. So two quick questions. One, in America you see a lot of regional humor, and that you see people who kind of, are this person of, or bending genres or bending regions. I know you talked a lot about about time-wise on when things are funny, but is there also a where things are funny, and is there a regional humor in China? And then the second question is, how much does sarcasm play into Chinese humor?
None.
In response to the first or second, sorry, so the regional or?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not by no means an expert on this, but I know, for example, like Jolie Bo is. I remember my ex telling me, like, in Shanghai he will crush, but everywhere else in China they hate him. He's like, a good example of extremely, locale, very regional humor, but despised everywhere else in the country.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. For example, like 相声, the form of art, is more popular in the northern part of China because the humor differs in China, and also that like Jody Boy is because he's a Shanghainese, so he does some of the Shanghainese material, and also he makes fun of like people from other part of China. And before, stand-up only takes off, I would say, like 2 years ago officially. Like before, it's really, really kind of like low-key and nobody knows about it. So when Jody Boy is doing it, like people don't know that, comedy is sometimes offensive. So people they feel offended in his comedy, and that's why other part of China don't like him. But Shanghainese people like him because he's very, Shanghai. And for sarcasm, yeah, we use sarcasm all the time. For example, I think your question is really smart, so that's sarcastic. And just an example. I'm just trying to say that.
I have some others you're gonna love.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of regional stuff. Xiangcheng is very popular in the north. Up in Dongbei in the northeast, they have a long sketch comedy history, xiaopian. And so a lot of the sketch comedy, one of the problems we had in running knockoff SNL was that the audience had this weird, they had this weird connection in their mind where they thought that sketch kind of had to look northeastern, even though it didn't. Even though the themes necessarily weren't northeastern themes, we wound up having people have a little bit of trouble making that leap, and some of the sketches that felt right were the ones that felt more northeastern Chinese. As opposed to, I was an American on the staff and I love SNL, and the people on the show loved SNL, and we were trying to make stuff that looked like SNL, and then the stuff we passed through wound up looking like stuff from the Northeast. So how did that happen? All the people on the staff who were Chinese had some sort of orientation that was just kind of heading in that direction. And as for sarcasm, I feel like a lot of foreigners, a lot of foreigners who go to China, Chinese people are generally very polite towards foreigners. Oftentimes so polite it's difficult to make a connection sometimes. And part of the thing about being polite is you would never ever be sarcastic to a foreigner learning Chinese. Because it'd be such bringing the hammer down of using your language in a way that this person doesn't speak your language. Why would you ever do that? It can only be self-serving. And so as a result, I know a lot of foreigners who are like, well, I never hear people be sarcastic. And I'm like, you should go to comedy shows. Because they're not sarcastic to you. That doesn't mean there's no sarcasm going on or the sarcasm doesn't exist. It's definitely in the comedy. And you can even be sarcastic in Chinese, but it does take a little bit of an effort because the Chinese people, when they're parsing foreigners speaking, are not expecting them to speak particularly well, so they're just trying to understand what you're saying. They're not listening for really subtle linguistic hints. And so, when I have jokes that do sarcasm, but I don't put them in the first 15 minutes of the routine. I want you to completely forget that I'm talking to you as a foreigner before I'll do jokes. Like, I have a joke that I do about the time that I was on a Chinese TV show. And part of my challenge of doing the TV shows is they have absolutely no trust that I know what type of material I should be saying. So whenever I perform on a show, I have to one-on-one do all my jokes for the director before they film them, because they don't even trust the written script that I sent in. So I was on a show once where I had to do one-on-one for this director in front of this big theater the day before the performance, and so I picked a joke that I figured would be pretty safe. So I was like, oh, there's so many people here. There's no one there. There's so many people here. Like I come on stage and I can understand the most amazing thing about the Chinese people. There's so many of them. Really basic joke, kind of, but I thought it was safe. And then he's like, oh, that's really good, but we can't air that. You can't air that, why not? And I'm like, because, it might bring up the one-child policy issue. And here's the sarcasm part of the joke, and then I go to the audience and it's like, because, maybe I missed this, but I didn't think that there was a lot of Chinese people was a secret. I thought people knew that, and so that joke will work, but it's super sarcastic, but it totally works. It just, you kind of need to bring people along to that moment where they're ready to hear it. It would probably be very different for you doing the sarcasm. You can probably just be sarcastic. And it would work out, but I think it's, it definitely exists, and I'd be interested in figuring out where the idea that there's no sarcasm in Chinese comes from. Because there's a lot of people who ask this question. You probably hear this a lot, right?
No, people just say that when I'm being sarcastic, I'm being too mean.
Oh, really?
They're like, Chinese people should not be sarcastic. You're such a mean person. And I'm also a girl, so like, you're a mean girl. I'm like, what? With feminists into it?
Yeah. I don't know. But yeah, there is sarcasm.
And your question about the regional stuff, definitely the 19th century, one of the ways you showed you were a Beijinger was by being able to mimic the accents from people from different regions, people from outside who have come to the metropolis. And there's some like specialized markets, just the Shanghainese will listen to Shanghainese comedy. So there's not one single Chinese sense of humor. A lot of it is very linguistic based. Cantonese humor is very, very different.
Accents are really huge. Like even like in what we found out in if you think about like English stand-up, a lot of times stand-up is not just one person talking, you inhabit other people. And so, if I'm like, I got into a cab, he's like, yeah, where you going, boss? Going into that accent is part of the performance, and it's the exact same thing in Beijing. If I was like, 我打了一个车, speaking in standard manner, 打了一个车, 哎，去哪儿啊? When you go into that character shift, that is, I'm not talking in the joke and saying regionally, cab drivers in Beijing speak, but it is exactly that. Like people realize, and then if there's a person, you have a foreigner in that car, or if you were from the south of China and people hear that you speak with this Cantonese accent, and then you go from the Cantonese accent into the Beijing accent, people feel the clash of the culture in there, even within the same country. So that's a really big thing in a lot of the Chinese stand-up I watch.
Thanks.
Right here.
Where we go?
Go to the right side, you guys.
So I wonder when you tell people you're a comedian, how do people respond in China and America? Because I couldn't imagine I telling my Chinese parents that I'm a comedian, that will be a joke.
That's interesting because there's a cultural element there too, right? The society's perception of the craft of comedy.
Yeah, so I am more happy to tell people that I'm a comedian in here because I get a reception as a hero. Like everywhere I go, if I say I'm Chinese, I'm a comedian, they're like, oh, you're a genius, you're amazing, I need to take a picture of you. People are just like so glad I'm doing this. But then in China, still like if I say I'm a comedian, to young people, they will still think it's great. But when I tell my parents, they're like, so what, you're unmarried. So it's like, I get no credits of that at all. And they're like, oh, so they come to my show and they see like most people, like other comedians are guys. And at first my mom was very happy. She was like, oh, there are a lot of guys. But then she was like, oh, they're all broke. So she became unhappy again. So even until today, I still keep a job because I can make them happy. They don't think I will be living home and then eating on their petition and not able to feed myself. But that's very sad.
But I mean, is it becoming more and more of a viable career path in China, or like how does that look? How does that landscape look for somebody that wants to get into professional comedy?
I think that you can still try to be an open micer and then try to do more comedy, but then it's very hard to be a full-time comedian. Like most people in China, I would say if they are a comedian, they will have to do other jobs. For example, they will have to be a script writer for a TV show, or they have to do some operation work in the entertainment work, or they have to do marketing. They can do a flexible job, a type schedule job, but they have to have another job to support themselves.
I've got an interesting question. So in America, having moved to New York, I don't know if anybody here knows this, but you don't actually earn money doing comedy. In New York, if you want to earn a living, you got to go on the road, right? You got to be a traveling comedian. I wonder, is that even a thing in China, like a traveling road comedian that does gigs around the country?
Jesse's more experienced, but I don't see one that's particularly as mature as what's going on here.
So here it's a little bit different because the market for stand-up exists and people want to see stand-up. In China, selling tickets is basically 99.99% celebrity power. If you're a celebrity, you can sell tickets for your talk show, even if you've never done stand-up before. Because people are not coming for the thing, they're coming to see the celebrity. This makes it very difficult to do stand-up on the road. Because if you try to perform in a second or a third or a fourth tier city outside of Beijing or Shanghai, where you've kind of accumulated your own audience, it's very difficult to sell those tickets. It's not necessarily an easier way to make money. An easier way to make money would be to do like a Chinese New Year company parties or like stuff like that. Like every Chinese New Year, every company does a party. And it's an awful place to do stand-up, but you could get paid 10 times what your normal rate is to do 5 minutes at a company party. And if you wanted to make money, you could go on the road to as many company parties as you want. But it's not the same sort of thing. I have made money, I guess, on the road. I perform on Royal Caribbean cruise ships. So like Royal Caribbean has ships that go from Shanghai to Japan and back. So that's a lot of road time. But that is an opportunity that would be in Beijing or Shanghai. And then I do shows in America, which is very far on the road. And so I come to America and I do shows at universities and art centers and China Institute. And all of these things knit together make it a little bit easier to make a living. But some of these options I only have because I'm American. And so for the Chinese people that want to do stand-up as a career, what in the last 2 or 3 years you've started to see basically venture capital companies creating, like hiring stand-ups on salary to either write stand-up or produce some sort of show because they found that people's parents won't accept them doing this career unless they say they have a job. And so a lot of the impetus to sign is not because the comedians necessarily think it's going to be better for their comedy, but at least I have a company behind me. At least our show might get made. At least I can tell my parents I get a salary and I'm employed somewhere. And I think that goes a long way to solving that problem. I also, in addition to having 2 markets to be able to work off of, I have very supportive parents that are excited that I'm doing something that I think they knew that I was always interested in language and culture, and they also knew I was a funny guy. And so for them, they look at what I'm doing and they're like, yeah, that makes sense. I think this is something that they understand that I'm having a good time doing, and that is something that I could do that really fits my personality. And at least, I managed to make a good enough living off of it that I don't need to ask them for rent money. So, maybe until I have to ask them for money, they're supportive, and then if it didn't work out, they'd be less supportive. But if I'm able to make a living off of it, if you can make a living off of it, the only difference is how big is your apartment? Because because you're going to work hard either for a company or you can work hard doing what you like. And if you figure out just a way to get all the numbers to work out doing what you like, if you're willing to live in a little bit of a smaller apartment, it all kind of comes to the same thing. So that's been part of the fun of trying to do comedy in China as well.
Cool. All right, last question. Right there, you go away.
You talked about that politics is not allowed to make money, and that pretty much anything else. A lot of comedy in stand-up is off-color, it's really can be very low, it depends on the audience, etc. Is that a taboo also, or can you have some equivalent to second comedy of the aristocrats joke.
Oh, yeah, this is like super, super dirty. How do you feel dirty comedy plays in China?
Well, for English, because the audience are like mostly expats, so they know what comedy is, and I think it just works as it works here. But for the Chinese audience, like this is just a topic that we don't really discuss in public or in private with the parents. So people will feel super intense and they would not be comfortable. And then it would just, I don't think it works that well, to be honest.
So that's not really a matter of censorship, it's just like it won't land, you know?
But let's also be clear that we're talking just about stand-up comedy now, because there are other venues where you certainly have like invective and dirty stuff. A lot of it is anonymous and online, indeed. But like tonight we're mostly just talking about like one part of the market. So I mean, there are plenty of really funny and sometimes edgy films, right? So there's some films that are definitely worth seeing. And even though mainstream, but I do think that a couple of the things that are difficult is if it's being recorded. So like if someone's recording your show, you could get in trouble if you cross a line, or if it's in print. So like to get a book published, you can get books published with obscenities in them and obscene jokes, but you do have to pass through a censorship process, and so it's difficult.
Yeah, I would say, from my perspective, if you're trying to do dirty stuff, a little goes a long way. Because you can think about it as you always say, you don't want to cross the line. But where is that line? In different cultures and different topics, the line is in a different place. So if my goal is to be edgy, as defined by going right up to the line, I'm not judging that based off what Americans would think is edgy. I'm judging that off of the people I'm seeing in this room right now. How far do I go before I lose you people? And a little will go a long way. The other thing is it's kind of like the politics in the sense that if you found a way of being super funny, super dirty, you just wouldn't see your career take off. Because like here we have HBO. Like there is a place where if you wanted to do something super dirty, you could air it. But in China, all of the state media companies all have to play to every age limit at every time. There's no after dark. There's no place to put that. The internet platforms are not technically running on the same rules, but they will always trip over themselves to do something if they believe it will help them get in better with the government. So they're not going to stick up for your dirty show. Live, you're probably fine until you start going over 100 seats, and then you have to send in scripts and then get everything officially stamped, and then like the ticketing platforms don't want to be known for having dirty shows, so you're not going to have any major sources of getting tickets out. So it's just sort of like it's sort of like survival of the fittest almost. You just don't see it that much, but it doesn't necessarily mean people don't think it's funny. It's just you don't wind up seeing as much of it.
And you can think of it being like the Bowery many decades back, where all the vaudeville promoters want to say this is family-friendly entertainment. You know, you will not be harassed if you bring your women folk to the audience.
But the stuff that is dirty or more political, a lot of it's done in either with a pseudonym or with some sort of pseudonym equivalent, like by being more anonymous, it actually helps the audience also get over it a little bit. Like I'm thinking of the like Balls of Da Shijian, like the Balls. It's like a comedy news show. The guy who hosts it is in this weird, ridiculous, over like giant head mask thing, and part of it's just funny, and it's actually like a real good comedy choice because everybody's seen somebody at a desk, but nobody's seen somebody with this giant mask thing on a desk. But even though once they got bigger, obviously at some level the government knows who's making the show. It's not like they're really protected by the mask, but it does, I think, allow the audience to have a little bit of a more gap with the performer and make it a little bit less like, oh, that guy's really dirty or that guy's saying something inappropriate, and more like, he's the host of a show. And a show specifically vague. And I think that does help maybe a little to get those things. If you wanted to be super dirty or you wanted to be more political, having that gap would actually be helpful.
Look like a jester, essentially.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
All right, that's all the time we have. Guys, please give a big round of applause to Christopher, Jesse, Norah, and Christopher.
So I just wanted to thank you once again. You know, we don't get to laugh a whole lot at China Institute these days because there's a lot of serious stuff going on. So I just want to thank you one more time for making us laugh tonight. Thank you.